I'm at the corner of North Julia Street and West Monroe Street in downtown Jacksonville. Here, nestled against the side of the state attorney's office and tucked in a stand of palm trees that partially conceals it, stands a nearly 100-year-old historical marker indicating the site of a, quote, ancient Timucuan Indian town from earliest times until about 1700. Stories about this ancient town, now supposedly buried beneath the streets of downtown, abound online. It's even mentioned on the city's Wikipedia page. In some tellings, it's ballooned to a thriving metropolis and cultural center that was once home to as many as 2,500 people. Despite historians and archaeologists working tirelessly to learn more about the people who called Northeast Florida home thousands of years before Europeans arrived, most people know very little about the indigenous history of what's now Jacksonville. And some of what we think we know? Well, it may not be true. I'm Brendan Rivers.
I'm Tammy Cherry.
And you're listening to Bygone Jacks, our unsung history from WJCT Public Media.
In this episode, we're exploring myths and misconceptions about local indigenous history, focusing on the Timucua, people who lived in what's now South Georgia and North Florida and spoke dialects of the Timucua language, and their forebears.
First, how one mistake led to the creation of a myth about a Timucua community in the heart of downtown Jacksonville, and the far more fascinating true story.
And a few quick notes before we get started. In this and the following episode, we'll be talking a lot about both the Timucua generally and more specifically the Mocama, Timucua speakers who lived in the area around modern-day Jacksonville.
Keep in mind that these indigenous people never actually called themselves Timucua. That name was first used by Europeans and has been adopted by scholars to describe the various peoples who spoke the Timucua language. Similarly, Mocama is a dialect of Timucua, not a self-identification. And for historical context, we will be sharing quotes from primary sources, and some of those sources did use racist or derogatory language.
It's called Ossachite.
Ossachite?
Ossachite.
Ossachite.
I don't know. It's a made-up place.
That's archaeologist Keith Ashley, who teaches anthropology at the University of North Florida and has spent 20 years excavating indigenous sites in Northeast Florida.
To me, it's that fish story where it's told and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But the thing here is there was never fish to begin with. So it's crazy that I've heard that from so many people. And every time I see it, I think it's tracked back to Frederick Davis.
Thomas Frederick Davis was born in Virginia in 1877 and grew up in Gainesville. After graduating from East Florida Seminary, Davis worked for the National Weather Bureau. He even had a stint in the Jacksonville office.
In 1905, he moved permanently to Jacksonville, and within 6 years had published his first book on the city, The History of Early Jacksonville, Florida. A revamped and expanded edition, History of Jacksonville, Florida and Vicinity, 1513 to 1924, was published in 1925 and remains one of the most frequently cited books on Jacksonville's history.
In that book, Ossachite is mentioned just once, on page 24, in a footnote.
One of the earliest Spanish maps shows an Indian village here called Ossachite. This liquid Indian name, Ossachite, is the earliest record of a name applying to the locality of Jacksonville. It was a Timucua village of probably not more than half a dozen houses thatched in the Timucua style.
Davis locates this village a short distance inland from the river, near a good, clean spring, not far from the foot of Liberty Street. It's from this singular passing reference that a myth was born. Since the publication of Davis's book, many histories and guides to Jacksonville have mentioned Ossachite. It even turns up in a player-modified version of the video game Civilization IV.
There's just one small problem. Ossachite probably never existed.
I don't think there was such a place in Jacksonville, but I'd be wrong before. And if someone can come up with a good map that shows the site there, that would be interesting. But I don't think it exists. I've looked at, every old Spanish map of Florida over the last 30 or 40 years, and I just think that it's an error or somebody put it in as a joke or something. Who knows?
That's Gerald Milanish, Curator Emeritus in Archaeology at the Florida Museum of Natural History in Gainesville. He's written extensively about the Timucua throughout his career.
Ossachite may not show up on any maps, But something else does that caused local author Bill Delaney and his friend Doug Henning, a Timucuan researcher, to develop their own theory about the source of Davis's cryptic reference.
If you've ever seen old European maps, you know how fast and loose they are with the details, especially of places that they hadn't actually gone to. And so there is one map made in 1684 by a French map maker named Jean Franquelin. And in that, it includes a town that did exist called Ossachite. And Ossachite was a real Native American town. It was a real Timucuan town, but it wasn't anywhere around Jacksonville. It was out in the Ustoga territory, the territory of the Ustoga Timucua, which was out west of the Suwannee River.
Ossachite was located in the Panhandle, somewhere near the Osceola River. It was one of the indigenous villages in the path of Hernando de Soto's brutal 16th century expedition to the southeast.
De Soto arrived in Ossachite in September of 1539. Garcilaso de la Vega's The Florida of the Inca by the Inca, published in 1605 and claiming to combine several first-person accounts from the expedition, described the conquistadors' arrival.
The army thereupon crossed the river and traveled 2 leagues through a treeless land, coming eventually to a place where they found great fields of corn, beans, and a type of squash known in Spain as Roman squash. Beginning with these fields, there were settlements which were not arranged as villages, but which were separated and spread out over the distance of 4 leagues that remained to the principal town, which was called Ossachite. This place contained 200 large and good houses and was the seat and court of the curaca and the lord of that land, who likewise was called Ossachite.
So, how did Davis get from the real but distant Ossachite to an imaginary Timucuan village in the heart of Jacksonville? A look at a 1706 map that's hanging in the Louis Ansbach room at the main library makes the origin of Davis's mistake clearer.
This map shows things like mountains in the Florida Panhandle and a giant inland sea and approximately where Atlanta, Georgia is, and of course fabulous creatures that don't exist. But one of the things that he shows is he puts Ossachite in an area that, if any of this was accurate, could be mistaken for Jacksonville, Florida. So I think that essentially what happened is that Davis saw that map, or one very much like it, and said, hey, that looks like that could be Jacksonville. That's Ossachite. That must be the Indian town that was here. And then he kind of extrapolated it.
But does that mean there was no Timucuan settlement in downtown Jacksonville? Both Milanish and Ashley agree it's possible there's evidence of indigenous occupation buried beneath the banks and city offices of the urban core, but at the moment there's no archaeological evidence and nothing in French or Spanish records to suggest that a Timucuan community called Ossachite once stood in the heart of what's now downtown Jacksonville. So why does this narrative persist?
Well, because it's a good story.
It's this romantic story of a lost Native community that was where Jacksonville used to be, but that disappeared around 1700.
Denise Boussy is a history professor at UNF who teaches courses on local indigenous history and the Native South. She and Ashley are working on a book about the indigenous history of the region, and she says Davis, the originator of the Ossachite story, was part of a movement of non-professional historians whose work was frequently more about boosterism than facts.
And this is a phenomenon that's happening around the United States, beginning in the 1880s into the 1920s, when we see the rise of local historical societies with folks like Davis who write accounts of their cities that are intended to cast indigenous people and other people of color in a particular way to tell an origin story that really begins with Europeans. So, for example, with Davis, he starts with the Spanish. And that's where he says the city begins and its history. So this is a process of creating myths about indigenous communities that are then conveniently gone, who are sort of part of a romantic past, but not accurately.
Milanish sees an element of myth-making in Davis as well.
If you've got an Indian village in your town and you could put up a historical marker, it's of interest to the people and it enhances your community and so forth. It would not be the first historical marker in Florida that was incorrect. Many of them were, and over time they get corrected, but some are still there.
As Boussy points out, This is the problem with relying on Davis's book as your primary source of information on Jacksonville history. Something that happens pretty often, probably because it's freely available online.
So that is almost a century old, and it was written by someone who wasn't a scholar. That was not his goal, was not to tell an accurate. He probably would tell you he thought he was telling an accurate, story of the past. But imagine using medicinal information from 100 years ago to treat yourself today, right? You wouldn't do that.
And yet still, somehow, the story pulls us in.
Sometimes people want to think fantastic stories like that are more exciting when in reality, when you start seeing the archaeology, it's not. What's really going on here, I think, is much more exciting than that.
Because there was a thriving indigenous cultural center in what's now Jacksonville, but it was a few miles east of downtown and existed almost 1,000 years ago. More on that after the break.
Join the most essential conversation in Northeast Florida and Southeast Georgia. Every day on First Coast Connect, hear from the biggest newsmakers and changemakers in the region. We also want your phone calls, emails, and tweets. Engagement is what drives this program. I'm Ann Schindler. Join us weekdays at 9 a.m. on WJCT News 89.9.
Hi, join me, Dr. Joe Servin, for What's Health Got to Do with It, a weekly program that examines where and how healthcare intersects with your daily life. I'll speak with local and national healthcare leaders to help you navigate your most pressing medical issues. Email health@wjct.org to join the conversation and tune in Saturdays at 4 p.m. and Sundays at 9 p.m. on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. I'm standing on a sidewalk alongside Fort Caroline Road between Jones and Gin House Creeks, looking out at Mill Cove. There's a great blue heron balancing delicately in the wide stretch of cordgrass between where I stand and the open water. In the distance, sunlight glitters off cars crossing the Dames Point Bridge. It's difficult to picture now with the noise of the traffic and the brackish-smelling, muddy expanse before me, but a millennium ago, this was part of a stretch of clear water and sandy beaches that was home to a thriving indigenous community and ceremonial center which built on a monumental scale and whose complex social ties extended 1,000 miles from Jacksonville. But in order to tell that story, we need to go back to the beginning. The indigenous history of Florida goes back more than 14,000 years to the tail end of the last ice age, when humans first made their way down into the peninsula. Some of the first evidence of their presence can be found in the Ossachite River, east of Tallahassee.
Back then, there was no Ossachite River, just a series of sinkholes where people hunted large game like mastodon, which wandered the state along with giant sloth, dire wolves, and glyptodons, ancient cousins of the armadillo that were about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle.
The average temperature would have been in the mid-50s, and the state was much drier. In fact, the St. Johns River didn't exist yet, and with lower sea levels, the Florida Peninsula was close to double its current width.
This far back, there's not much evidence of human settlements in the Jacksonville area, though it's possible they lived in areas that would now be under the Atlantic Ocean.
And so what we know so far through archaeology is that 13,000 years ago, we start to see indigenous people moving through the region and using it on larger sort of seasonal movements.
That nomadic occupation by small kin groups continued for millennia, evidenced by a scattering of stone projectile points like spearheads and knives, until the Ice Age ended and the seas started to rise, slowly at first, until the waters reached the shallow slope of the continental shelf, and then much faster, up to nearly 100 feet a year. That's when the St. Johns River started to take its current shape.
We start to see about 6,000 years ago more permanent habitation as the estuaries stabilize. And what you need to remember is that our coastline was 70 miles farther out. So this was in an interior location until then.
We're talking about a time roughly 3,000 years before the birth of King Tutankhamun in Egypt, and just about 1,000 years before cuneiform writing was developed in Sumer.
So really, when you think about the history of northeastern Florida, I know we just celebrated like a 200-year anniversary. 97% of the human history of northeastern Florida is in indigenous history.
These new permanent settlers lived mostly off marshes, so they were clustered at the mouth of the St. Johns River, on the barrier islands, and along the coastline. Around 4,500 years ago, they started making some of the earliest pottery in North America, an innovation they may have developed to work around a monopoly on soapstone held by indigenous people in what's now Georgia.
It was roughly around this time, and just a couple of centuries before the stone circle was raised at Stonehenge, that Northeast Florida's indigenous community started to build on a massive scale.
Some of these earliest architectural formations along the Atlantic coast are called shell rings, and we see the earliest shell ring along the Atlantic coast and the largest shell ring along the Atlantic coast right here in the Jacksonville area on Fort George Island and nearby Black Hammock Island.
Shell rings, which weren't always actually rings but did have a curved element to them, were made up of discarded oyster shells and refuse. The Rollins shell ring on Fort George Island was more than 620 feet across, and the interior plaza is as long as about 1.5 football fields. And much like Everbank Stadium, it was probably a place where people from different local communities came together for feasting and cultural exchanges.
Shell ring architecture in this area went up in two main spurts, with the second ending more than 1,500 years before the birth of Christ. Then, for a period of about 2,000 years, beginning in 500 BC, indigenous people in the Jacksonville area switched to building monumental sand burial mounds. Which brings us to the Grant and Shields Mounds, the largest mounds in Northeast Florida.
Clarence B. Moore, an amateur archaeologist whose destructive methods make him a controversial figure in the field, studied both mounds during his time working in the area in the 1890s. At the time, the Grant Mound, which was shaped like a cone with the top cut off, stood almost 27 feet tall. Moore writes about the site in the book Certain Sand Mounds of the St. Johns River, Florida.
6 days, with a force of 16 men in all, were devoted to the mound. Its composition, judging from the parts exposed by us and sections laid bare by the water, is of yellow sand, with a base blackened by fire, containing a heavy percentage of charcoal. Near the surface, beneath the summit plateau, were masses of oyster shells, while single shells are scattered throughout the mound.
The owner of the property where the Shields Mound stands refused Moore's request to dig there, something Moore dismissed as superstitious terror. But the owner may have just wanted to conserve the site, since Moore's excavation of the Grant Mound had demolished it. Moore was eventually allowed to examine the site of the Shields Mound, however, and found it unique.
So regular and symmetrical in every way is this great earthwork that its origins were universally attributed to the Huguenot French by those living in the neighborhood. It is not likely, however, that the ill-fated founders of Fort Caroline, probably at St. John's Bluff, a few miles below, had time or disposition to pile up great masses of sand.
Located just half a mile apart in the Fort Caroline area of Jacksonville, these two mounds bookend what's known as the Mill Cove Complex, one of Florida's major indigenous communities 1,000 years ago. Although man-made changes to the river over the last century have turned the cove into a marsh that's only about 1.5 feet deep at low tide, it was once a clear body of water almost 20 feet deep lined with sandy beaches. And it was a perfect fishing spot.
So they're living off, and they're living well off shellfish and fish. So we see incredible amounts of bone in these shellbins. They're really living, the good life. I think Mill Cove was an incredible fishery. You see reports of it in the early 1900s before it started all silting in with all the dredging that was going on. I think Hemingway and Ted Williams and stuff fished, Mill Cove. So this was really a productive area for them. So they were really, that was kind of driving their domestic economy.
These pre-Timucuan indigenous people also ate turtle, deer, and various birds, plus the occasional otter or bear. Corn farming wouldn't begin for another few centuries, so they would also gather wild plants, nuts, and fruits when they were seasonally available.
But Mill Cove wasn't just a small fishing village. The sheer quantity and diversity of remains at the site suggest it was used for ceremonial feasting and burial preparation. Artifacts found there also prove Mill Cove had broader ties to the Mississippian world, a group of Native American chieftain groups spread across what's now the Midwestern and Southeastern United States. These groups, which flourished between 800 and 1600 AD, were distinguished by their intensive maize farming, building large mound complexes, and engaging in far-flung trade and exchange networks.
So we have connections between where we are and Galena that is coming from the Ozarks. We're looking at Arkansas, Missouri. We have lots of different types of stone that are metamorphic rocks that are coming from the Appalachian Mountains. So we're looking there at North Carolina and Tennessee. We have mica that's coming from that area as well. We have copper that is coming from, so this is pre-European copper. There has been some sourcing of the copper done. Most of it's probably coming from the Appalachian Mountains, but we have it coming from the Lake Superior region as well as some float copper that's coming from Wisconsin. We're actually getting ready to do a new round of copper sourcing. So we have really these materials that are coming in from these great distances.
The largest settlement in the Mississippian world was called Cahokia, located directly across the Mississippi from what's now St. Louis, Missouri. Thought to have been the largest pre-European urban center in what's now the United States, it flourished from about the time of the Norman conquest of England through the beginning of the Renaissance in Italy.
Cahokia is kind of like the New York City of 1,000 years ago among indigenous communities, and we have artifacts that are unequivocally from Cahokia here in Jacksonville.
Ashley has found some of those artifacts himself, including a couple of what's known as Cahokia points, distinctively side-notched arrowheads made of silicified limestone. These tiny relics, only a few centimeters long, represent an impressive, almost 1,000-mile journey.
So it's a great distance away. So it's not a straight line shot. It's not like they're just going down the Mississippi River and that's it. It's been calculated that this could have been like a 120-day round-trip journey.
Even more evocative are a pair of small copper ear gauges excavated from the Grant Mound by Moore in 1895 and now held by the Smithsonian. Fashioned in the shape of faces, these maskettes have square foreheads, circular eyes, and long, thin noses.
A handful of similar figures have been discovered across the Mississippian world, mostly along the Mississippi River or its tributaries. Their rarity suggests exchanges between Cahokia and indigenous populations here in Northeast Florida may have been more complex than simple trade relationships.
This could be the result of pilgrimages, people going to those areas. It could be the place of people in Cahokia basically coming here. Why would they come here? Because the Atlantic Ocean to them would be literally the eastern edge of the world. And so they would be coming here learning about the great waters, the sun coming up from the waters. Got to be an awing kind of experience. So then they can get the shells and things from here. So we think it can be pilgrimages. It can be knowledge seeking on the parts of other people. It could be diplomatic relationships where there's giftings to establish alliance building. And then in return, this is kind of reinforced over time. So there's a lot more going on than just trade.
The Mill Cove complex thrived between 900 and 1250 AD before tapering off, possibly due to increased local raiding or broader political and social changes in the Mississippian world. After that, local indigenous communities became more insular, and their far-reaching networks were broken up as they started moving around again. When they eventually settled back down, they started farming corn for the first time.
And that's where we start to see the Mocama or the Timucuan-speaking Mocamas in this area, which people are more familiar with. And then we see them enduring for another 150 years here in this area with interactions and entanglement with first the French and then the Spanish.
13,000 years of history and a thriving community with relationships that spanned half the continent. That's a story of breathtaking scope and complexity, and one that's much harder to fit on a historical marker than a romantic tale of a long-lost village with a misread name.
It's really a dynamic history. It's ever-changing. I think sometimes people always want to think it only changed after European arrival, and that's not the case.
So why is it that Jacksons tend to picture indigenous people solely through the lens of how the Mocama existed in the 1560s? That's next time on Bygone Jacks.
This is Bygone Jacks, our unsung history from WJCT Public Media. Thanks for listening. I'm Brendan Rivers.
And I'm Tammy Cherry.
A big thanks to Jennifer Gray and her colleagues at Florida State College at Jacksonville, whose research made this podcast possible.
If you're interested in learning more about the River City's past, check out FSCJ's History of Jacksonville course.
If you'd like to learn more about local indigenous history, take a look at the show notes at wjct.org/bygonejacks, where you can find links to the sources we used and more.
And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review. Thanks for listening.